This film is the story of that search, of that sound, of the man who made it, the girl who sang it, and the monster who stole it.
When it comes to the films of the 70s, what do you think of? Rocky Horror Picture Show? The first Rocky movie? Maybe this is just showing my obsession with Phantom of the Opera, but my first thought is the cult classic Phantom of the Paradise. I love adaptations of Phantom of the Opera, even loose adaptations like this one, and it's through that obsession with Phantom of the Opera that I found this film. Every watch, I found some new detail, some new reference that I wasn't aware of before, and I love it. I'm so excited to chat all about this film, which shows its love for so many cinematic masterpieces before it. But before that, let's take a brief detour to talk about the plot, for those who aren't familiar with this cult classic.
It's not just songs. It's more. It's much more.
The plot. Phantom of the Paradise is a 1974 horror comedy musical that mixes elements of Phantom of the Opera, A Picture of Dorian Gray, and Faust, among other smaller references. Don't worry, we'll get to that later. Phantom of the Paradise follows composer Winslow Leach as he composes his rock opera version of the Faust legend. Along the way, he encounters the famous Swan, a media mogul behind many hit musical groups and chart-topping records under his record company, Death Records. Swan is looking for a new musical act to open his new theater, the Paradise. This is when he encounters Winslow, playing music from his Faust cantata, and Swan is immediately interested in Winslow's work. This is where it all heads downhill, as Swan steals Winslow's music and mutilates it to the point that it's nearly unrecognizable, at first glance at least. In order to get away with doing so, Swan ghosts and frames Winslow with drug possession, sending him to a prison which Swan is also invested in. Upon learning that Swan stole his music, Winslow snaps and breaks out of prison. Winslow breaks into Swan's record press, and during his attempt at destroying the stolen music that Swan is getting ready to sell, Winslow gets his face and vocal cords mutilated by a record press. This leads Winslow to haunt the Paradise and plan to stop Swan from further ruining his music, and ensuring that the woman he's fallen in love with, in the meantime, Phoenix, will sing his music as Winslow intended. Along the way, we not only follow this bare-bones skeleton of a Phantom of the Opera-esque plot, but also encounter Faustian elements, such as Swan's deal with the literal devil, and then bargains with others, such as Winslow and, eventually, Phoenix. The original deal between Swan and the devil is under similar rules as A Picture of Dorian Gray, where recordings of Swan age in his stead. It's all of these elements alongside the ever-transforming music of Paul Williams that mix together to become Phantom of the Paradise. It's this framework that leads the film into commentary on the music industry, with each of the main characters playing a different part, and showing how the industry deforms artists and their works in the pursuit of stardom. Another idea throughout the film is how death and depravity have become common forms of entertainment, where an audience is primed to accept anything as part of an artistic vision.
An assassination live on television, coast to coast, that's entertainment.
With that quick rundown, let's chat about the characters, starting with Swan. Swan is the first character that we are introduced to within the film. The opening narration, done by Rod Sterling of Twilight Zone fame, is amazing and a bit creepy. We already know that Swan is quite successful, having gotten awards as just a teenager, which makes that tape of his breakdown later in the movie, while still alarming, an interesting look at Swan's life. The use of mirrors and Swan's first-person perspective after the Juicy Fruits performance is something I really enjoy. It almost calls back, for me at least, the way in which the Phantom of the Opera, the original book, described the Phantom, lurking unseen but very much heard within Box 5. It also, obviously, gives off that never see the person behind the curtain vibe that big companies have had over the years, but especially now in our modern age. The mirror just reflects back the performers themselves, not the person behind it all, which can be seen in the industry over the years. Seriously, if you were to try and list off a bunch of record labels that are around today, how many could you name? How about musicians or groups themselves? Probably more the latter than the former, right? Although it's not shown for a while after the opening monologue of the film, Swan is shown to be everywhere. His company, Death Records, also sometimes seen as Swan Song, hidden away in some shots, but we'll talk about that later, is particularly seen at every turn. We see him not only in the music industry, but also with ties to the police, who frame Winslow for possession of illegal substances with the intent to sell, and even sponsoring or otherwise being a large part of Sing Sing prison, both with the teeth replacement program and in general as we see Winslow in the Swan Enterprises branded hat. Of course, we either see the Dead Sparrow logo or some form of Death Records or Swan Song branding on everything from security cameras Swan uses to jackets or clothing that his security guards or other hired help wear, and even Swan's bedding. There are also swans used for doorknobs and other subtle details like this throughout the film, especially within the Paradise. These little details go a long way to showing just how much influence Swan has within the world of the film. Speaking of the world of the film, the Paradise, amongst a lot of other places owned by Swan, like Swanage, often has backgrounds or walls done up in either black or red, which are traditionally associated with hell and the devil. Funnily, the production designer Jack Fisk has said that he was warned against using black and red color schemes, given their stereotypical use within the media about the devil. This just made Fisk incorporate it more, apparently. Love that mindset. This devilish nature also contrasts well with Paul Williams' general appearance. He is naturally short in stature and would generally be a quite unassuming figure, much like how the devil is said to blend in and be in the most unexpected of places. Also, please tell me I'm not the only one saying they missed out on doing a beat it over the head reference towards the devil's lettuce. Damn it, they should have just used it for one of their drugs. Just me? Okay, moving on. I believe this everywhere at once branding fits in amazingly well when Swan is revealed to have made a deal with the devil. In some ways, it seems that this deal may have made Swan into the devil himself. Swan makes devilish deals with both Winslow and Phoenix, sealed with blood, just like his own deal with the devil. As is seen in the original Faust, the devil is a figure who has a lot of power and influence, which Swan has, especially once he signs his contract and becomes the media mogul we know him as today, or back in the 70s. Whatever. The devil is usually a mythologized figure that is said to be everywhere, especially in popular media over the years, which makes Swan being such a big figure in the industry make a lot of sense. Even within the film, we hear the song Never Thought I'd Get to Meet the Devil, which talks or sings about how the devil is quite an elusive being, hard to get a hold of directly. Of course, this is also foreshadowing Winslow's own deal with the devil, but definitely can be taken as Swan being the devil, considering Winslow is quite literally walking up to meet Swan.
Heard he always worked alone, that he seldom rode or used a phone, so I walked right up to meet him at his place.
This bigger-than-life figure of Swan is an interesting one, also, as Swan is often seen and talked about by newspapers, on the radio, and presumably other media, despite often being a person that tries to stay in the shadows and secretive in places like the Paradise. In the first scene that actually features Swan himself, we only get to see a first-person view from his perspective, as we discussed a moment ago. So when we hear Philbin or other security guards shoot down any attempts to capture Swan on film, it can initially be tied to that semi-secretive, not seen by many presence. At least, to my recollection, it made the reveal of Swan's Picture of Dorian Gray contract to be that much more shocking upon my first viewing. Of course, that first viewing of the film was well over a decade ago, so forgive me for not using more rock-solid terms about years-old reactions. This element of the plot works quite well with the theory of Swan being the devil himself, actually. Often a figure said to work in the shadows, much like Swan, and as previously stated in Never Thought I'd Get to Meet the Devil,
Heard he always worked alone, that he seldom rode or used a phone.
He is often seen working with only Philbin. Yes, he may be surrounded by women and his guards, but I'd argue that he's not working with them, but rather that those people are working under him. While he is recorded by his security cameras, we see him maintain his good looks. I'd love to just attribute this to the devil is always going to look attractive, but I think it's more likely that they filmed the scenes the first time around and didn't have the budget to film them again, much less with prosthetics or with digital effects on Mr. Williams himself to make him look older. Considering they already had to put effects on William Finley's voice, it probably wasn't that much more to add a couple lines of dialogue from Paul Williams to have edited as well, especially as his singing voice was already being edited for use for William Finley's Phantom's modified voice. I suppose that's as good of a segue as any into talking about the new voice that Swan creates for Winslow. At the beginning of the film, we see William Finley's voice as Winslow as he sings Faust at the piano. Immediately we hear Swan talking about how Winslow's voice is not right, but the song he's singing is the perfect material with which to open his new theater, the Paradise. So when Winslow shows back up later in the film, having escaped from Swan's prison program in Sing Sing, deformed and having lost his voice, it's obviously the perfect chance for Swan to mold that imperfect singing voice into something better, as Winslow's vocal cords are too ruined on their own to even let him talk, let alone sing. So Swan is going to take that opportunity and mold the voice into something more in line with the brand he's built up around him. During the sequence in which Swan is messing around with all the chords, buttons, filters, and dolbies, the singing voice we hear him eventually call perfect is actually Paul Williams' own singing voice. Obviously, this is pretty perfect for Swan's character because, of course, essentially the character of the devil would love his own actor's singing voice. It fits together like two pieces of a puzzle. So essentially, Swan gives Winslow his own voice, which could be seen as another piece in the ways to control Winslow Leach puzzle, because if Winslow sounds more like Swan than himself, it's yet another part of Swan's empire he can claim. If Swan's own voice is attached to this dead man, A, less people are going to recognize the dead man's voice after his supposed death, and B, it's a more homogeneous look for Death Records with just his voice and the voices he meticulously chooses to represent him. And C, this dead man will have less upward mobility of his own within the industry because his voice is always attached to Swan, so he can't really escape that. As with the other main characters, Swan is a commentary on the music industry. He is the kingpin, the one at the top of the pyramid. We see the Juicy Fruits at the top of the charts, as well as the other two bands they become. They do make objectively good music at times. Outside of the film, the soundtrack album did reach that famed gold status in Winnipeg, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. I mean, some songs are better than others. Upholstery is one that gets torn down a lot, and I understand why. Swan's the one supposedly putting together and pushing for the success of the Juicy Fruits as a group, which is pretty industry putting together a boy band of him. It's obvious how this reflects on the real-life boy band groups and how they've been pushed towards a general audience, despite not necessarily having any particularly good content. Yet, the group grows in popularity with ravenous fans who don't necessarily pay attention to how good or bad the sound is. It's popular, and that must mean that it's good. His status in the music industry isn't the only method of control he exacts upon the artists underneath him. Swan also controls his artists and performers with drugs. The obvious ones are where we see Beef snorting coke in his dressing room and his talk with Philbin.
Speed? Yeah. What do you know about it? You just pass the stuff out. I take it.
We, of course, also see Swan more directly giving drugs to Winslow while he's composing. And I believe Phoenix also partakes in limousine, but this isn't too clear. I may be wrong on that. Of course, there's also an aspect of dependency when it comes to drugs, making sure that those under him don't leave him, and thus leave their source or their dealer. But he also gets Swan the results he's looking for. I'll talk a little bit more about what those results are when we delve into each character a bit more, like Winslow. Winslow, from the start of the film, is seen as a bit of an underdog. The first shot we get of our main character is him quickly and a bit sloppily putting up his little banner over the top of the Juicy Fruits advertisement. Winslow Leach at the piano. It's a simple proclamation, but one that he hopes will draw people in to see him perform. In the next shot of Winslow, an impressive one-take shot of the Juicy Fruits equipment being taken down as Winslow wheels out his little piano. I believe I heard it being called a spinet, but I'm not sure of the model. We see this all a little out of focus and off to the side of Philbin rambling about a singer named Annette, who we never really hear about again. I love this action shot, and it sets up many such background action shots that will appear within the film, like the car bomb scene. Now, of course, Swan hears Winslow's Faust during the latter part of Philbin's monologue, and we, like Swan, are taken for a closer look and listen into Winslow's performance. We can see that when performing his music, Winslow really is all in his own world, as he moves his body around like a rag doll while playing. I've seen performers feeling their music, but I don't think I've ever seen it to this extent. I don't realistically know how Winslow could be playing this well with him pulling away from the keys that much. I say that as a pianist myself. This scene does also show Winslow, though in his own little world, is still looking for that recognition, as he tries to catch the attention of anyone that happens to be passing by, like he hopes to catch their eye and ask them to stay and listen to his work. But especially when it's just a head bob kind of movement, we can see just how involved in his music Winslow is. Despite the rather unfortunate syncing issues at some parts of the song, kinda covered up in some parts by the movement of the camera, we can hear the passion in Finley's singing voice. Even when Winslow is locked away in what is called the electronic room composing his cantata, aided by Swan's drugs, he's still really in his own world, as shown by his obsession with Phoenix and the montage, although the montage itself is also a pretty good reflection of the timelessness or loss of time that could be felt on drugs. His belief that his rock opera about Faust would be performed in its entirety unchanged and to his exact specifications does, in a way, also reflect Winslow being in his own world, including his innocence regarding the industry. At the mere suggestion of a group he dislikes being associated with his music, Winslow loses his temper on Philbin at the beginning of the film. This also shows both how possessive of his work Winslow is, as well as what kind of a threat he can and will be later in the film. The fact that it is such a blind rage is interesting to me, considering his actions later in the film. Now, this blind rage around his work does lead me to consider the similarities between Phantom of the Paradise and Universal's 1943 and, moreover, 1962 adaptations of Phantom of the Opera. The similarities between Universal's Phantom of the Opera and Phantom of the Paradise can be seen rather easily by comparing the starts of both films, though Phantom of the Paradise has argued that it uses these similarities as an homage and a parody/comedy. In both films, a composer submits their life's work to be published by a larger-than-life figure in the industry, but when it is discovered that that work is stolen, the main character enters a rage and attempts to destroy the stolen copies of their work. In this attempt at destroying these stolen copies, they find themselves accidentally harmed by a part of the publishing process. Winslow by a record press, and in the case of the 1962 Herbert Lom film, a tray of acid. In a blind attempt to find relief for their pain, the main character stumbles and falls into a river. So yeah, the setup is pretty similar in that way, but I'll talk more about what happened on the lawsuit side of things a bit later in the video. Back to Phantom of the Paradise, Winslow seems to have an interesting blind spot. Just before getting locked in the electronic room to compose his heart out while obsessively thinking about the insta-love of his life, Phoenix, he enters a contract with Swan. Once Swan finds out that Winslow is terrorizing the Paradise, Swan makes a deal with Winslow that in exchange for not terrorizing this new establishment, Swan would find a way to bring back Winslow's voice and would ensure that Winslow's work is performed to Winslow's specifications. Once Swan finds a way to get Winslow a voice, which we've already established is really Paul Williams, the actor behind Swan's own voice, he presents Winslow with a contract. Despite his life's work being a story all about a man who makes a deal with the devil in exchange for worldly pleasures, Winslow doesn't recognize that the contract Swan is suggesting is a similar kind of Faustian bargain. Just as in Faust, Winslow is blinded by his interest for a woman and he signs away his life. After signing this contract with Swan, in blood, mind you, damn it, Winslow, out of all the signs you should have seen, this is the one you missed that I just don't understand. Winslow enters a drug-fueled haze in order to rewrite his cantata. Swan literally just leaves him at the piano to sleep and compose, waking him up in the morning to a breakfast of a smorgasbord of pills. This is how Swan keeps Winslow under control, is the drugs, ensuring that he is able to hammer out a whole cantata in what I'd assume to be quite record time. No, we don't really see how long Winslow is composing for, not for sure. We do see a calendar ripping off its daily pages throughout the drug haze, but from what I can tell, there's not a lot of context as to when this started or really took place. This drug haze is just enough to ensure that Winslow just keeps composing non-stop until the work is done, making Swan's main reason to control Winslow with drugs to ensure his writing and creativity are fueled. Another subtle way I'd say Swan's influence on Winslow is shown is the physical Death Records logo that is burned into his cheek by the record press. It's another bird-themed piece of Swan's bird-themed life. Am I stretching this idea? Maybe a bit, but I think it's interesting that there's one more bird symbol in this movie that is just stacked with birds. Speaking of birds, let's move on to a different character who is named after a bird. Phoenix. Phoenix is the character that, although we see her a decent amount in the film, is fairly simple to describe as a carefree spirit. From the moment we meet her on the stairs, waiting for her chance to perform, we know her one goal is to sing. It's repeated again and again. She meets Winslow, and though she does care for him, it doesn't seem like his love for her is reciprocated, or at least not done so equally. She remembers him, and when Winslow drags her to the roof of the Paradise to get away from the Raven crowd, she does recognize his name and, like pretty much everyone else, had considered him to be dead. Phoenix doesn't take Winslow's advice to stay away from Swan, instead seeming to do the exact opposite after meeting with Winslow, and entering in some kind of intimate relationship with Swan, and entering into her own contract in order to secure her career, the one thing she truly cares about. Although it should be said that she signs this contract under the influence of some of Swan's drugs, Swan uses these drugs on Phoenix, seemingly to ensure that she will sign the contract, despite her being very willing to go all Little Mermaid mode and give up her voice for the chance to perform. This could be seen as another commentary, this time on artists forced to sign predatory contracts in order to advance their career. Presumably, a main musical group within the film was also forced to sign a contract in order to guarantee their success. The Juicy Fruits / the Beach Bums / the Undeads. Up until this point, I've basically been referring to the Juicy Fruits alone, but I hope it should be obvious that it's all the same trio, no matter what kind of music they're performing. To my knowledge, the group actually isn't referred to within the film by their other two names, instead with Beach Bums / Undeads showing up in the credits. So, like the film, I've been solely referring to them as the Juicy Fruits, and will continue to do so. Now that that's out of the way, let's actually talk about this group. This group changes their identity pretty much every time they turn around within the film, with music from the 50s, 60s, and 70s all being represented within their combined catalog of music. That being said, just because other decades are represented, that doesn't mean that the music is good. The Juicy Fruits end up performing songs and at least attempting to transform songs that aren't their own, but they seem to get a little bit better at this with each attempt, and each member of the trio gets a chance to be in the spotlight, which I think is a nice touch. With their ripoff of Winslow's Faust, their source material is quite obvious to the film's audience. Not only does it essentially reuse the music and melody of the original, just changing the beat and the lyrics, it does so very poorly. Poorly on purpose in a defense of Paul Williams, I should say. There's this concept within the film that if, at a very superficial surface level, the music sounds okay, then the listeners won't care. Again, we come back to Philbin's words of wisdom about nobody caring about a piece of music.
Nobody cares what anything's about.
That being said, in the third song by the group, it took a bit longer, for me at least, to realize what it was ripping off. Instead of going for a third rendition of Faust, the group changes Phantom's theme to Life at Last, which is interesting to me. It's this theme of the film of taking music and changing it so much that it becomes a poor reflection on the original. It just makes me think about music today. The original idea that Brian De Palma had for Phantom of the Paradise came from an elevator music version of a Beatles song. Obviously, a poor cover of a song can reflect poorly on the original. I feel like this can also extend to artists who sample the music of others. Often hearing the hooks or this copied music in general just makes me want to go and listen to the original instead. There are a lot of songs released today that are samples of another person's work. It often gets me wondering, where's the line between sampling and you can copy my homework but just change a few things so the teacher doesn't notice? We don't have to go far from the glam rock aesthetic of the movie. David Bowie's Rebel Rebel has a hook has been part of a song by country artist Chris Young in the song Young Love and Saturday Nights. Or going a little further, David Guetta and One Republic heavily sampled Dragostea din Tay by Ozone. Forgive my pronunciation, it's also known by some as Numa Numa. In their piece, I Don't Want to Wait. Both of these songs, while it's neat to see references to another person's work, just make me long to listen to the original piece instead, as it instantly calls to mind that original work instead of being quite as transformative as I think it intends to be. Yes, I know that there's the old argument of nothing's truly original, and that everybody references someone. You could say that this video is unoriginal, as I'm far from the first person to make a video talking about Brian De Palma's film. Editing MB here, I realized within this part of the original video it may have come off as me comparing sampling a piece of music as outright stealing, as that is a main part of the film. A piece, when sampled, is credited, and that means that the original artist is credited as a writer or artist within the song. So, for example, Ozone credited as a author of the song that used them for sampling. So no, it isn't stealing. This isn't quite what I was intending. In interviews with Brian De Palma, we hear Mr. De Palma speak about how the original idea came from a piece of elevator music, transformed a song into something almost unrecognizable. It was something that presumably made one just want to hear the original instead of this terrible copy of it. In a similar way to that terrible transformation, I feel like sometimes sampling can come off in a similar way that just makes one want to hear the original piece, not that which is sampling it. It can be slightly transformed, but you know where it came from and what it was originally. Can sampling lead to good songs? Sometimes, yes. Just like there can be good versions or covers of songs amongst the bad ones, I find it's best when unnoticed. If you can get into a song and then realize, oh hey, this has another cool song I like, or this is a version of another cool song I like, it works a bit better than those parts that stick out like a sore thumb. Of course, everyone will have their own opinions and experiences with this. The examples I gave previously were songs which, to me, those samples just stuck out way too much. Maybe you love those songs or don't think that the sampling is as egregious as I think it is. That's all well and good. Everybody is entitled to their opinion. Sampling does have a place in music and art creation, and that's fine. I just think it is something that, when done wrong, can really stick out, but when it's done really, really right, it can blend in with the rest of an artist's work and be just fine, just like any other piece of work. And again, this is just my opinion. Now, back to the original video. Obviously, this is all just my own opinions on the transformative qualities of music and references made today, take it or leave it. I think that the Juicy Fruits also speak at least a little to how the general public views a public figure trying to change their name. Given that I'm only calling them the Juicy Fruits, and their actual changed names are basically only present in the credits, calls back to other popular artists trying to change their image, like Prince changing to this symbol. And let's be honest, everybody still just calls him Prince. Or, for a much more recent example, let's take this website. Its name has been changed to X for over a year now, since July of 2023. I can probably count on one hand the people I know who actually call it X instead of Twitter. Despite the Juicy Fruits trying to change their image, I'd be surprised if it actually would have worked in universe. We, as the viewers, don't really get to see this part of the story, and though I understand why, I think it would have been an interesting little idea to dive into for a scene or two. There is another performing artist within the film whose contract we also don't get to see, assuming he actually is under one: Beef. Beef is a fun, interesting character in the film for a wide variety of reasons. First, he is a flamboyant glam rock icon. Throughout the film, we see him in various bright outfits that remind me as much of David Bowie as they do Elton John. From when we first see him from the perspective of Swan's huge record table, he strums a singular, discordant, wavering chord on an electric guitar and tries to look macho by showing off his muscles, doing the same kind of scream singing we see him doing throughout the film. We see right off the bat that Beef is not a good performer, but that is probably exactly why Swan chose him, to mess with Winslow. In rehearsal, his singing and performing are not good. He's laughed at behind his back, but is told that he should make the piece his own. In doing this, making the piece his own at the final performance, Beef shows that he can effectively give off the illusion of being a good artist, despite his performance being viewed as bad by his peers. This is presumably a similar approach that Swan took with the Juicy Fruits. Their music was at times quite mediocre, but they gave off the illusion that they were a good group of musicians when presented to the public. Right in with one of the themes of the film. Commercialization of music can lead to some pretty bad in disguise products. While we don't get to see much of how the Juicy Fruits react when offstage, we get to see a lot of Beef's offstage personality. He's portrayed as a quite superstitious person, similar to the character of Carlotta in Phantom of the Opera, or a main performer or diva in general. Upon being confronted with the idea of the Phantom, Beef is quite hesitant about performing a dead man's music. He is prodded forward by Philbin on multiple occasions. This is where the idea of Beef being controlled by drugs comes in. He is seen quite often taking speed, snorting the drug multiple times in his dressing room before being told by Philbin that he should take a depressant before being herded back to the Paradise to perform. The way that Swan uses drugs with Beef is to get the diva to actually perform, perhaps by increasing his concentration and well-being? I don't know, I'm going off drug descriptions here. Now, of course, Beef could also be seen as a comment on performers in the industry, who are willing to do whatever they can to get ahead, and being more than a bit full of themselves. Beef can be very confident on stage, even if he makes a fool of himself while doing so. He could be seen as overconfident in his ability to perform, especially once stoked by Swan, being given the freedom to do whatever he wants with the material without care or thought towards the audience.
Far out.
Given his inflection, outfits, and general attitude, he's a very cut-and-dry gay stereotype. It has been said by Garrett Graham that this was something that De Palma led him towards.
They were saying to me, no, we'd like him to be flamboyant. And it finally dawned on me what they were talking about. Oh, you mean like this?
Even citing Little Richard as an example of what to aim for. This is a sort of bright, flamboyant look that a lot of artists were adopting at the time. David Bowie, Elton John, or even in the 80s with Boy George. Beef definitely has that gay flamboyance in his outfits, actions, and speech, not to mention his performances. An underrated gay icon if I ever saw one.
My music is for Phoenix. Only she can sing it. Anyone else that tries dies.
Throughout the film are a lot of smaller references to media. There are some that are consistently referenced throughout the film, appearing here and there, and others that are more one-off. Throughout Phantom of the Paradise, we see a lot of references to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In the first shot we see of Swan with his white-gloved hands, it's said by the people at Swan Archives that this is a reference to the gloves worn by Dr. Caligari within the film. But I feel like this might be a little bit of a stretch when it comes to a reference. I see those gloves and automatically think, well-to-do man in an opera box, or even just the fancy cartoon character gloves. Usually not, but I had to mention it. More direct allusion to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari comes in the scene where Swan introduces Beef to the media and public. In the scene, Swan is fully decked out in a top hat, tie, and jacket. This is where I can see the reference when being paired with other elements like this. It also introduces Beef by revealing him in an upright coffin, with Beef opening his eyes just like in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Though in Phantom of the Paradise, Beef also takes the opportunity to look directly into the camera and hiss. The next reference of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari is when Beef makes its first appearance on stage. This time, the backdrop is a huge reference to the sets of the 1920 film. I'll show a comparison on screen here, as Phantom of the Paradise does a pretty commendable job at copying these backdrops. They also do a really good job with the makeup of the band, which is a reference to Caesar, the somnambulist. No, it's not Kiss. As explained rather comprehensively by the Swan Archives website, it was kind of something that happened on both ends around the same time, as Kiss wasn't prominent at the time and their first album came out after the scene in Phantom of the Paradise was already filmed. Now let's go over some of the other references, a bit faster. Psycho is very obviously referenced with the shower scene, but Winslow uses a plunger to silence Beef instead of more deadly means. Edgar Allan Poe's Casket of Amontillado, I believe. That story was referenced when Winslow was bricked into the recording studio. When Beef was told to make the songs his own, it seems that he did so with the overall story as well. Instead of the performance being a reference to Faust's story of a deal with the devil, it instead references Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, with a creature being put together from the spare parts of dead bodies, with the new name of the band, the Undeads, being a reference to that story of being brought to life, as well as the song of Life at Last in general. There is a lot of Frankenstein references. Speaking of songs...
No, not him. Music. Listen to the music.
The music. Paul Williams is the amazing composer of the songs you hear in Phantom of the Paradise. Everything from Faust to Hell of It, and everything in between is Paul Williams' work. Honestly, I think this shows a pretty amazing range that Williams has when it comes to his ability to write music, especially when you consider he was known for more of a folk sound before this film. It was only after this film that he got into writing for people like Daft Punk, the theme for The Love Boat, and perhaps most famously, writing the Kermit the Frog classic Rainbow Connection. Phantom of the Paradise is really the first rock or mix of genres that Williams is known for, and he does wonderfully in his attempts at writing songs that sound straight out of the 50s, ripped from a Beach Boys album, or even the glam rock kind of sound that came around the time of the film in the mid-70s. Paul Williams expertly takes the concept that Brian De Palma talks about, transforming a piece of music into something that can only be called a shell of itself, an utter disgrace to the original, but somehow genuinely makes it so that it's still a bop. From Faust being transformed into upholstery to Phantom's theme being changed into Life at Last, the music truly gets transformed, and sometimes in ways that you have to know what to look for in order to really hear it. Of course, these transformed songs aren't the only ones in the soundtrack of Phantom of the Paradise. We also get really enchanting, haunting songs like Phantom's theme, also known as Beauty and the Beast, which plays during the montage sequence in the electronics room. You can really hear Williams' voice in this song, which I've always quite enjoyed ever since I first experienced this film. While we're talking about the songs, something I never knew the story of until researching this video was the end credit song, The Hell of It. I thought that it was just a great song that got used for the credits, but in reality, it was a song that was part of a whole cut sequence of events within the film. If you listen carefully within the song, you can hear what I thought was some sort of weird drum sample upon first listen, but is actually the sound of a little girl tap dancing. The story goes that the song was used for the sequence of Beef's funeral, which Swan would attend, and during which a little girl would see Swan and start tap dancing upon Beef's coffin as a sort of impromptu audition for Swan before the funeral continued. So that tap dancing was actually within the track itself, even though the film sequence was scrapped. I suppose this is as good a transition as any into the use of diegetic and non-diegetic music within the film, as it seems to have a mix of both, though it does lean a bit more heavily into diegetic. A quick vocab lesson. Diegetic music is that which characters in the film can hear, and this music is often part of the story itself, like Ariel singing Part of Your World in The Little Mermaid, she's actually singing, or in this film, Old Souls is really Phoenix singing on stage, not just something used in the background of a film. Most of the music is like this. Faust, Upholstery, Old Souls, Somebody Super Like You, and more. There are a couple that I'd argue are non-diegetic, however. They don't seem to feature the character themselves singing within the film, like with Never Thought I'd Get to Meet the Devil and the earlier mention of Phantom's theme, although the latter song could be something that Winslow composed or was composing at the time. I think that the nature of the montage signals that it's as much of a time skip as the visuals, just something to move along the drug-addled scene. I think it's great that there is a mix of music within the film. While most of the songs move the plot along, whether serious or as a way to get a laugh, the non-diegetic songs like Never Thought I'd Get to Meet the Devil are a great way to show characters, hints at the plot, and just have a bit of fun. Now, as mentioned, not everyone provides the singing voice for their character, or at least not all of the time. Jessica Harper is, I think, the only one that completely voices all of the songs that her character sings. When it comes to the character of Beef, it seems pretty split down the middle as far as what is being sung by which singer. Ray Kennedy dubs over Beef's singing within the Life at Last scene on stage, but Garrett Graham voices Beef's singing in both the shower scene and in Beef's original audition for Swan at the weird golden record table. Winslow, as far as I can tell, gets voiced by William Finley for his first song, Faust. Maybe Never Thought I'd Get to Meet the Devil sounds a lot like Finley to me, but the rest of Winslow's singing is dubbed by Paul Williams, as noted before being the perfect voice for Swan to give Winslow, given that it belongs to the actor playing Swan. The sequence of Winslow composing in the electronic room is one that I've always loved the look of. It's this giant one-of-a-kind machine that Winslow is playing called T.O.N.T.O. T.O.N.T.O stands for the Original New Timbral Orchestra. I've also heard it called the Original Neo Timbral Orchestra, although Neo and New, same difference, half dozen to one, six to the other. This is the world's first multi-timbral polyphonic analog synthesizer. If you're anything like me, you hear half of those words and go, huh? Basically, it's a giant machine that is able to make many different sounds at once, thanks to the use of many different synthetic sound generators. There's a video down in the description in my references that goes into more depth about T.O.N.T.O by one of its two creators, the late Malcolm Cecil. The other creator being Robert Margouleff. Excuse me on the pronunciation of that name. It is mostly thanks to that video, though, that I've been able to even start to understand T.O.N.T.O. Despite the synthesizer not being used for any of the music or effects within Phantom of the Paradise, I think it's a neat piece of tech. So let's talk about it a bit, because I've never seen anybody do so. There are many different synthesizers that make up T.O.N.T.O. Originally, there were a couple of Moog 3C synthesizers, custom second-generation Surge synthesizers were just another part, as well as the ARP 2500 and two ARP 2600s. Four Oberheim SEMs were another part of the giant Mod Podge of modules that made up the T.O.N.T.O unit. There were also various custom-made products by Moog and others that went into T.O.N.T.O. From what I can tell, here's basically a quick, crudely made chart that I made to detail the different synthesizers that are a part of T.O.N.T.O. I'm not certain that these are or were all pictured within Phantom of the Paradise, but as of 2020, this seems to be the layout. Something I think is really interesting is how all of these synthesizers together, from everything I've heard about T.O.N.T.O, it really has a mind of its own. Despite having all the keys, knobs, buttons, wires, plugs, and more from what I've seen of T.O.N.T.O, you're never going to get the same sounds out of this thing twice in a row, especially during a live performance. That is such an interesting bit of trivia about this huge synthesizer. In Phantom of the Paradise, many of these modular elements can be seen, even if they weren't necessarily heard. Unfortunately, although T.O.N.T.O was used as the setting of the Phantom of the Paradise's electronic room when they were filming in New York, none of the sounds within the film are from T.O.N.T.O itself. There's a part of me that's sad that none of T.O.N.T.O's sound was used in Phantom of the Paradise. However, given its rather unpredictable seeming nature, I can understand why. But I love that such a cool instrument is a permanent part of Phantom of the Paradise's history. T.O.N.T.O was purchased in 2013 and has resided ever since in the National Music Centre in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I wish to go and see it one day, though I have doubts that will ever happen. The portions where we see Swan twisting a bunch of knobs, adjusting faders, and pressing buttons were all filmed in Record Plant Studios Studio B. As far as I'm aware, the sections at Record Plant also were not the effects used on Winslow's voice. These are all said to have been done in post-production, so all the filters and Dolbys weren't done at the time of filming. I'd say they did a pretty good job at having it sync up and make a sort of sense what Swan was changing in theory. Now, speaking of production, let's dive into the production of Phantom of the Paradise.
The paradise is more magnificent than I ever dreamed.
Production. As I've stated throughout this video, it is said that the idea for the film came to Brian De Palma when he heard an elevator music version of a Beatles song. It is a bit debated as to whether it was I Wanna Hold Your Hand or Day in the Life, apparently. I've always heard it as the latter, but Swan Archives seems to notice a discrepancy over the years of interviews that De Palma has given. Either way, it was that flawed, strained version of an otherwise good song that gave De Palma the idea to make a film about the degradation of music, as well as a bit of a disillusion about the music industry in general. The film had a rather small budget, which meant that there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of artists that weren't necessarily paid or credited for their work, like the creator of Winslow's helmet, Sonny Berman. Sonny's brother, Tom Berman, apparently also worked on the prosthetic of Winslow's scarring and the chrome teeth that Winslow gets at Sing Sing. Unfortunately, both brothers were not credited in the film, with John Chambers being credited instead, whose studio they had worked in. Costumes like Jessica Harper's were often a bit of collaborative piece, as Harper says that she was the one behind the fedora in her Special to Me sequence, or the famous antler belt that Beef wears after hearing Winslow's scream at being bricked into the electronic room. That antler belt was made after a suggestion from Garrett Graham, and costume designer Rosanna Norton. Apparently, both Beef and the Juicy Fruits were inspired by drag queens and what she calls a gender confusion aspect, but I might just call that androgyny. I guess it was that kind of glam rock look that David Bowie rocked at this time. The smaller budget of the film also led to things like the tinsel-esque background during Life at Last, and a lot of the backgrounds that were black or red walls were done for budgetary reasons as well, according to production designer Jack Fisk. Though the red walls, especially in the scenes with Swan, do give off that classic devil-inspired look, although it was suggested that this would be a bit cliché to do, he did it anyways. Another fun fact is that in the final scene with Paul Williams, we see Swan wearing a full-face silver mask. This mask was actually the life mask Paul Williams had made when he worked on Battle for the Planet of the Apes a year or two earlier. A life mask is a mold of an actor's face that is taken in order for the makeup crew to design prosthetics for the actor. So the Battle of the Planet of the Apes makeup crew originally took that and used that face mold of Paul Williams to base the ape makeup on. And then the production crew of Phantom of the Paradise took that afterward, painted the mold silver, and just used it as a mask for Paul Williams. It is a little large on Williams' face, as he supposedly lost some weight between having that life mask made and using it to film Phantom of the Paradise. But I think that it's just a really cool way to reuse something that's usually a behind-the-scenes element, especially as an on-screen element instead.
There really is a Phantom. He was just in my shower. He threatened my life!
The lawsuits and other difficulties. During the production of Phantom of the Paradise, there were a lot of issues. I'm going to attempt to go through these in chronological order. First, we have the original title of the film, which was going to be Phantom of the Fillmore. However, the rights to the name of the theater, Fillmore, weren't able to be obtained from Bill Graham, so the name of the project was changed in July of 1973. The next title that we see for the project was just Phantom, with this even showing up on early versions of the classic poster. However, there was a comic book character by King Features who was named the Phantom, a superhero in a purple suit and eye mask who you may be familiar with from the comic books, or like me, you may have seen the later 1996 Billy Zane film. Either way, this complication from the purple-suited superhero required that this project's name be changed once again. This led to the Of the Paradise being added to the end, changing the original poster art done by John Alvin, which obviously meant that the name change was pretty late, but I do much prefer this name. I think Phantom of the Paradise has a bit more life to it than just Phantom. During production, there was also a lawsuit brought up by Universal Studios, who saw the similarities Phantom of the Paradise had to their previous adaptations of Phantom of the Opera, mostly the 1962 film starring Herbert Lom and Heather Sears. This was brought up due to the similarities in the first part of the plot, as discussed, but we'll talk about it again. Both films feature a main character who had their music stolen by a big name in the industry, then while trying to destroy copies of the stolen music, the main character gets deformed. In our film, Winslow gets deformed by a record press, and in Universal's film, the Phantom gets deformed by having acid splashed on his face. Then, after being deformed, the main character runs and dives into a river to stop the pain they are in. Yeah, there are a decent amount of similarities when we put it like that. This lawsuit would have been taken care of without issue, but the team behind Phantom of the Paradise forgot to get insurance for errors and omissions, which would have covered them. Instead, the cost of making this lawsuit go away fell partially to financier Gustav Burns and 20th Century Fox. In the end, the film didn't need to be changed because of this lawsuit. The next lawsuit, however, wasn't as easy to take care of. This has been given the name of the Swan Song fiasco. Basically, a few months before the release of the film, manager of Led Zeppelin, Peter Grant, discovered some significant parts of the film which he took issue with. Firstly, Grant had managed another band in the past called T.O.N.T.O, whose lead singer was electrocuted on stage, not unlike what happened to Beef in the film, also causing the singer to die. Despite these similarities being present, the electrocution of Beef was not inspired by this real-life incident, having been in versions of the script from 1971, before the late Leslie Harvey passed away in 1972 during a sound check. Thankfully, the Beef electrocution scene stuck around, showcasing a really cool filmmaking technique of alternating frames of the film in reverse in 2-1-4-3-6-5, for example, for Beef's jerky movement during the scene, which I've always loved seeing and find this method quite an interesting one. The reason that this is called the Swan Song fiasco is not because of this T.O.N.T.O similarity, but rather because of the real-life record company that Peter Grant had created just a few months before the release of Phantom of the Paradise. This company was called Swan Song Records. This was the original name of Death Records in the film before Peter Grant forced the production and editing team's hands. Due to the original having the same name, Grant insisted that the film be changed, presumably to not affect the new record company he had with Led Zeppelin. Grant threatened to block the film from release unless the most prominent references to Swan Song Enterprises and Swan Song Records were removed from the film. This caused a lot of crops or cuts to some pretty smooth camera movements that showed just how integrated Swan was in the universe of the film. The first shot we get of Winslow was supposed to show Swan Song's logo above the juicy fruits before zooming in on our main character. There were also a lot of other logos of Swan Song that were covered up throughout the film, especially in the airport scene where Swan introduces beef to the public and media. There are a lot of Swan Song logos on cameras, signage, and crew members that we never got to see because it was covered up. In the airport scene, there's a pretty infamously slapped together traveling mat of the Dead Bird logo on Swan's podium. It originally had the Swan Song logo on the podium, but because of the way it was shot, there was a lot of the scene that wasn't able to be cropped or changed, so they were forced to put a different image on the front of the podium and track it to the best of their ability, causing a very shaky mess with the logo moving around a lot as the camera pans around the scene. This is also why the zoom in on Swan's face looks a bit grainy. It was supposed to also show the podium with the Swan Song name on it, but it was cropped in order to cut the reference out, causing the film to look a bit poorer in quality than the rest of the film. There are some long shots that were cut up as well, like the scene of Winslow going through the door of Swan Song Enterprises to see the secretary, which was supposed to be one long shot following Winslow through the door, but ended up being cut into a few different shots because the logo above the door had the Swan Song name on it. Also, the shot of the secretary flipping through the Rolodex was cropped because of the Swan Song logo at the top. This meant that we missed out on some names on the cards, like references to associate producer Abby Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, and more. There was also a Swan Song Enterprises logo on Swan's office building that was covered up, along with the miscellaneous cameras having logos on them, such as the one looking down from the skylight that Winslow was watching Swan and Phoenix through, and the logos on the bottom of the TV monitors in Swan's studios, which are covered by the Death Records bird logo. Honestly, there was a lot of good filmmaking and thematic through lines that had to be scrapped in order to comply with this order from Peter Grant. Though it costed them thousands of dollars to do this slapdash editing, they did end up releasing the film on time at the end of October 1971 or beginning of November 1971, depending on your geographical location. Now that we've covered all of that, there's some stuff that I'm really not sure where to put, but want to talk about anyways.
I like your name. We won't have to change it.
Some of these things I've mentioned in passing throughout the video, but I do just want to mention them here because I like drawing attention to them. Firstly, there's the Phantom's contract. Winslow goes through a bunch of different lines in the contract, which are all written in the biggest swirling font that you'd kind of expect for a deal with the devil. When watching this film, I always thought that they were just a bunch of legal jargon they took and slapped together and called it a day. Apparently, however, this contract is done up a bit more realistically. They got someone to do up a boilerplate or run-of-the-mill contract, but make the clauses as nasty as possible. I'm not sure if this really means that
Party of the first part gives the party of the second part and his associates full power to do with him at their pleasure, to rule, to send, to fetch, or carry him or his, be it either body, soul, flesh, blood, or goods,
was presumably real, but not sure if that is actually a transportation clause. Are people really out there talking with their lawyers about transporting souls? It is really cool to see written out regardless if it's real or not. One thing as a lover of stationery that I wasn't able to figure out in this scene was the pen. It has this reddish-brown barrel, presumably a silver clip or detailing, and a pretty small nib. While I did ask the principal archivist of Swan Archives, there didn't seem to be any information available about the pen. Unfortunately, from what I've found within the fountain pen communities I've looked in, there isn't a solid answer there either. It's most likely just a cheap pen somebody got at a store, which makes sense considering the budget of the film, but I would like to get myself a similar pen. I know in this scene where Winslow is rewriting his cantata that the pen is said to be a ballpoint, but it looks to be a bit more like a felt-tip marker from the way it writes. Another thing I want to talk about is the golden record table that Swan has in the room just behind his receptionist's desk. That record table is so large and seems to have no opening for Swan to get out. Even in the audio commentary, it stated that those with the microphones had to crawl underneath the table and point the mic at Paul Williams from below, and then at the other performers in order to capture the audio without being seen. All I can think about is how much crawling or scrambling over the top of this table it would take in order to get into the middle where Swan is sitting. I can't think of a dignified way in which to get to the middle of that record table, which is pretty hilarious if you ask me. It's really cool looking, as yet another golden record in Swan's collection, but definitely not practical. The table was said to be made out of wood and then had grooves carved into it in order to look like a record, and then obviously it was painted gold. Presumably this just means Swan has to unprofessionally scramble to get to the middle of his table, whether by crawling underneath it or leaping on top of it. While there could be some kind of hidden seam in the table, I like my silly concept better. Throughout Phantom of the Paradise is a pretty obvious bird theme. Swan is the name of a bird, and the logo of Swan Song is of a swan. The logo of Death Records is also a bird. A dead sparrow, actually. So while it doesn't fit in with the swan theme that is going on, it does fit together as a bird that is musical, and being Death Records, the bird being dead is obviously fitting there as well. There are instances of swans throughout Swan's properties, like the swan door handle going out of the electronics room. Then, of course, is Phoenix, who is also a kind of mythical bird. This could be a symbol of something not truly obtainable for Winslow. Phoenix's name is said to be perfect, not needing to be changed by Swan, presumably because of it both being the name of a bird and its mythological status, which could give off an air of being hard to reach as a person in the industry. The Phantom's helmet is also bird-themed, with the large beak protruding from the middle. This gives all three main characters a bird element with which to connect them, though admittedly Winslow's is a bit thinner than the other two, even if we consider the bird logo or the Death Records logo stamped onto his cheek, still not as strong. In the final scene, Swan has a host of dancers, which are all scantily clad in feathers and crow headpieces. The main reason I call them crow is due to the audio commentary on the special edition Blu-ray, in which these dancers are called crow girls. Fittingly, Swan is actually killed by being stabbed with one of the beaks of these girls' headpieces. As a final little bird joke, you could almost say that all of Swan's cameras give him a bird's eye view of the entire premises. Terrible? Yeah, okay, let's move on.
His fabulous group, the Juicy Fruits on the Death label, has taken the charts by storm.
Cult film success and status. When talking about Phantom of the Paradise, it's often said that it was a box office flop, and that it was generally only a cult classic afterwards. This is, well, mostly correct. As you may know, the film, for some reason, did amazingly well in Winnipeg, Canada. While the film didn't play for a straight year, as is often quoted, it did play for 4 months straight, and then after a few months of being away from the big screen, did come back for a handful of times over the next year or so. The film was such a success that the soundtrack earned gold record status in Winnipeg, meaning it sold over 40,000 copies in Canada, with supposedly half of those records being sold in Winnipeg alone. I guess this means that Swan's golden record table is kind of warranted here in Canada. Something I don't hear nearly as many people talk about is that the film also did well in Paris, which I have heard chalked up to Daft Punk's love of the film, having seen it 20 times at least. Although I can't really confirm or deny this. There are also some people that say this film did well in Japan. I have seen a fair amount of posters of Phantom of the Paradise in Japanese, so I could definitely believe this. Surprisingly, I have seen less French language posters of the film, despite it doing so well in Paris, which I think is interesting. I don't know what that says about its success versus the popularity of the actual posters in France, let alone those posters being potentially sold internationally some 50 years after the film's release. That's right, Phantom of the Paradise has been around for over 50 years now, celebrating its 50th anniversary on November 1st of 2024 here in Canada, which is when I originally wanted to release this video, but considering this script is currently over 11,000 words and still going, yeah, that didn't turn out quite as I planned. The film was celebrated with celebrations ahead of time in Edmonton, Alberta and Winnipeg, Manitoba, featuring screenings of the films and actors like Paul Williams getting to make guest appearances. The film was also celebrated in the USA in the Majestic Theater in Texas, one of the original filming locations. Although I was unable to attend any of these 50th anniversary celebrations, I'm glad that they occurred, and that this film is still such an important part of so many people's lives.
Nothing matters anyway.
catch the hand of it.
The book. Nobody really talks about this book, the fact that it exists, or what the content of this thing really is. That's for good reason. Phantom of the Paradise by Bjarne Rostang is bad. Really bad. Maybe as bad as my pronunciation of the author's name, so forgive me. From what the author has said about the work himself, I can understand a bit of why it was so poorly received. Apparently the book was the very first novel that this author wrote, having previously been a bike racer and a jazz musician. Bjarne Rostang wrote Phantom of the Paradise in 63 hours as a freelance writer, with the book being released in 1975 after the film. It says on the front cover that it was based on the original screenplay by Brian De Palma, which it also takes all of the supernatural elements and throws them out the window. You thought Swan was going to have a deal with the devil? Nope. He's not under contract seemingly at all. You thought it was going to be revealed that he, the man with the big bucks, can fix all of Winslow's problems while owning Winslow? Not really. Okay, well, if Swan isn't under contract, how about Phoenix? Nope. She doesn't have contract. She's just here because she wants to strike it big and is okay with getting in bed with Swan to do so. Alright, so if Winslow is still under contract, does that mean we get the classic making Winslow's voice scene? Nah, Winslow doesn't even lose his voice during his accident. Well, that sucks. That could have been a cool, if obnoxious, part of the book, having Winslow speak in a different manner thanks to the voice box. Missed opportunity right there. How about the big scene where Winslow sees Phoenix and Swan through the skylight and decides to end it all? Well, that isn't quite there either. At multiple points of the story, Winslow does have thoughts of ending it all, but he never goes through with it because he wants to get a bunch of ideas out of his head and thinks he's got too many amazing ideas that the world's gotta see. And if he isn't here to get these ideas on paper, well, that would be a damn shame. 'Cause get it? He's a full of himself hick that thinks too highly of himself? Like the first scenes in the movie? Get it? Get it? I feel like that's where the author got Winslow's entire character from. The first scenes we see of him in the movie. That's it. We see that Winslow is a loner who doesn't have people appreciate his work as everyone passes him by at the piano, and we see that Winslow is in his own little world while performing, as well as that he thinks that his cantata is the best thing since sliced bread, and is quite protective of it, giving Philbin a rough time for not getting it. That's his character, folks. His entire full-of-himself character, according to the book. And I hate it. So Winslow doesn't decide to stab himself by the skylight, and Swan doesn't come out with a contract being all, "Looky here, mister, you're not allowed to die. I'm also not allowed to die. We're both under contract. Look at the supernatural binding ability of this document you signed." Nope. So Swan's not revealed to be immortal, neither is Winslow, and Winslow doesn't find out that Swan has a deal with the devil, nor that Swan has secretly got himself a filmed contract of Dorian Gray in his studio to watch every day. Despite the multitude of references in the film to things like the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there aren't any such references in the book itself. Now, maybe this was due to copyright of the 1920 film. Sure, that could be possible. But if it wasn't possible to get that copyright, then why are there a bunch of mentions of Coca-Cola? I don't know why. The 4 mentions of this brand of cola is so jarring, but it really is. The book also excessively mentions the use of cocaine, which I can understand, given that drugs are mentioned in the film. As I said before, it's a film where we can see Swan controlling those under him with drugs, so mentioning cocaine within the book is an obvious idea. At first I thought that maybe the cola was a reference to the soda having cocaine in it. However, Coca-Cola stopped having drugs in it basically at all by the 1930s, according to Snopes. Maybe he was being paid by cola to promote the drink? Either that, or it could be that the common way to ask for a carbonated sugary drink is to ask for a Coke in the South. Though it does state that Winslow is from Maine, which is in the northern USA. It could also be that Coca-Cola was a popular drink. Any way I talk about it, it is still a small part of this book, but is something that stuck out to me over multiple readings. So overall, the book is written in a way that makes the characters not like themselves in the original film version, changes key parts of the story so it's less of a supernatural affair, and is generally poorly written. That's it, right? Did I mention that this book is surprisingly expensive for how poorly received it was? I don't know if this means that it was poorly received upon release as well, leading to low sales, or if it's just the way of old books that don't sell well, and that people tend to dislike. But Either way, I'm not a fan of paying the better part of $45 for a book that is way less than 150 pages. That was cheap, both when I got it and now, for a book that is, in especially for its age, superb condition. The only reason that my copy has wear on the spine or corners is because this book, despite its terribleness, and it has been with me across multiple moves since late 2017 when I purchased it. Books in worse condition are listed on eBay for over $100, including shipping. I bought it for $45 because that was the best price I had ever seen the book at, after having tracked its prices for a while, knowing that I would regularly have had to pay at least $60 for the book in worse condition. And yeah, $100 at least for the book today. That sucks. So, it's a bad book generally despised by those who have read it. A rare book that is fetching some outrageous prices for a small volume that it is, and a book that is literally just advertising the Better Than Itself movie on the front cover. Great combination of elements. Hate this book. 1 out of 10. Regret having read this book again for this video. I like having this rare bit of Phantom of the Paradise memorabilia, but it's not good by any means of the word.
Haven't we all had enough?
Now for the Extro. This has been quite a passion project for me over the last few months. It has taken me a lot longer to make this video than I originally intended. Heck, the scope of this video just seemed to balloon the more that I researched and worked on this project. From checking the commentary tracks on the film, to learning about T.O.N.T.O and diving into its history, and even just having the pleasure of exploring the novelization of Phantom of the Paradise. There were so many things that I'm surprised other people haven't talked about, or that someone hasn't put together in a giant video like this, at least to my knowledge. This really was a huge project that came out of my love for Phantom of the Paradise. There's a lot of research, and will be a lot of sites, videos, and documents listed in the references for this video that I really do hope that you check out if you're interested in even more information about what went into the making of this film. A huge thanks, of course, goes out to websites like the Swan Archives. There was so much information there that I was struggling to find elsewhere. The principal archivist, Ari, and others have done so much work and research, even beyond what I've presented here when it comes to Phantom of the Paradise, and practically every conceivable thing that went into making the film. I couldn't have near the amount of information about Phantom of the Paradise at my disposal for this video without that website in particular. I learned a lot about so many aspects of this film that I never knew before. I had an amazing time diving into the history of T.O.N.T.O, and I could have gone on so much more of a deep dive behind this amazing synthesizer, but I had to cut out a bunch from this video. I might go down another rabbit hole purely about T.O.N.T.O, or maybe synthesizers in general. There's already so much amazing information out there about T.O.N.T.O, its creation, its journey, and its life. The original new timbral orchestra truly has a mind of its own, and from everything I've heard about it, it's quite an amazing beast. I don't know how much I can say about T.O.N.T.O that hasn't already been expanded upon, even just here on YouTube over the past few months and years. Of course, all of the info I've got will be linked in the sources in the description, but T.O.N.T.O really makes me want to take a deep dive into synthesizers over the years, so maybe that'll be a project on this channel in the future. Might even end up bigger than this video. Who knows? Let me know if that's something you would be interested in. Of course, since this video was such a big project, if I did get something wrong, please let me know in the comments. I try to do my best when it comes to putting out these videos with accurate information that is as easy to understand as possible while still being informative. I couldn't have done this without the support of my viewers. I never say this, but if you like this video, please like it, comment, subscribe, share, all of that awesome stuff. It helps me know that there are folks out there that enjoy what I make and what kind of stuff I should plan to make more of down the line. If you have any subjects about mental health or LGBTQIA+ topics, please let me know down in the comments below. As always, my resources are in the description. Thanks for watching the OCD MB. Stay safe out there.